Welcome back. We are on the binding portion of the quilt now. We've already made the quilt, quilted the quilt, and we've made our binding. We took the 2.5 inch strip that we cut and we sewed them all together. We folded it in half to make our binding, and now we're ready to attach it. So we're going to take the raw edge of this quilt, not the folded side, but the open side, and put it alongside of the back of the quilt on the edge, lining the edge up. We're going to leave about, it's not specific, just 4 or 5 inches or so just hanging. We're not going to sew that down just yet, and I'll explain why in a minute. We're going to pin it right about that spot. So I've got this much hanging. I'm not sewing that down. Turn my machine on, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the side of the quilt, with the binding lined up with the edge of the quilt. We're going to do this until we get to the edge of the quilt. You can start this process anywhere along the quilt. Top, bottom side, left side, right side, doesn't matter. Just anywhere along the back of the quilt, lining that binding up. And I'll show you what we do when we get to the edge in just a minute. We're going to get to the edge, and maybe a 1/4 inch off of that edge we're going to stop. Then we're going to back stitch a couple times to lock those stitches in, and we're going to bring it back again forward to that same spot, about a 1/4 inch from the edge. We're going to pull this out, and we're going to cut these strings. Some people do, some people don't. Some people leave the strings, the threads, and don't cut them. That's up to you, however you want to do it. To me, it's just easier to just cut them and start over. But again, it's a preference thing. You do the way you want to do it. It's not right or wrong either way. Okay, then we're going to take this edge and we're going to cut it. We're going to fold it to straight at an angle, 45 degree on the edge. Then we're going to put our fingers on the edge and we're going to flip it back. So now we've got this. Let me show you again. The binding's hanging straight. Fold it to a 45 degree. Put your fingers there. Flip it backwards so that it will line up with the rest of the quilt again on the next side. Okay, we're to the edge of this side of the quilt. We're going to back stitch it in again. We're going to pull it, and we're going to cut those threads, and we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to pick this binding up, turn it to a 45 degree angle, and then flip it over again. So we've got it ready now. Go to this side of the quilt. And then we're going to stitch this side. And as I'm stitching, I'm not pushing the fabric along. Again, I'm starting a 1/4 inch in on this seam. I'm not, with this hand right here, I'm not pushing it. I'm just guiding it to try to keep it in line with the 1/4 inch seam. I don't want it wiggling one way or the other. So I'm not pushing this fabric through. I'm simply holding my hand there to guide that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Staying put. When you get near the end, you've got your piece here that we left hanging in the beginning. We're going to take this piece as the last, and this piece was the first. So we're going to leave that first piece alone. We're going to take this last piece, and I've got another piece of binding from another quilt that this was the binding where we sewed it, where we ironed it down. You're going to open that up and lay it sideways. Put it at the end of that first piece that we laid down that we did not sew down. Put end to end there, and then take this extra piece, lay it over the top, and where that black piece ended, you're going to cut it. Because that means you're going to have a 2.5 inch overlay from the beginning to the end now. So that's how we found that 2.5 inch overlay without having to measure. Then you're gonna take the pin out from the beginning. You're gonna take this, take it away from the sewing machine so you can see it. You're gonna take this first, the ending piece, right side together. Let me pin this up so it won't be pulling so and you can see it better. Pinning the quilt so it's not tugging. So you're gonna take this first, the ending piece, right side together, with the very first piece that we left hanging, right side together at a 45-degree angle. You're gonna cut that thread from where we just sewed. And I'm left-handed, can't do it with my right. So you're gonna put those right sides together at the angle, at the 45-degree angle, and you're gonna sew diagonally across it. You can pin it if you like, but you don't have to if you can hold it in place. It's up to you. If you're just starting out, I would pin it, sew diagonally across, cut that seam, cut that thread, cut the excess beyond that seam at a 1/4 of an inch. So you're gonna throw this part away. Then you're gonna have it like that. When you open it back up and you take that pin back out, it should lay flat. And there you have your binding. Now all we have to do is sew this little piece down that we hadn't sewn yet. Save that black piece for the next binding I do. As long as I have a 2.5 inch seam, that's all you need. Once you have your binding connected there at the end, you put it back under the machine and you sew that piece from the end where we connected them down to the quilt. Again, you're going to keep it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All the way until you get to the part where you had started the quilt. Back stitch it or do a couple extra stitches to lock it in. Pull the thread out, cut it, and your back of your binding is done. The next step would be to turn it over and to do the next other side of the quilt. So we're going to turn it over. And we're going to take this. You'll have strings along the way that you can clip as you go, just to get them out of your way. You're going to take this binding that you sewed on the back. You're going to flip your quilt over to the front of the quilt, and you're going to flip this piece over from the back. So here's your back binding. Turn it over to the front of the quilt, and you're going to cover up that stitching line. You see that stitching line that we have across the front now? That was where we were on the back of the quilt putting the binding on. Now we come to the front and we see that stitch. We're going to cover that stitch with that binding. So you're going to have it look like that instead. Then we're going to come around here. And we're going to stitch it down. Okay, now we're on the front of the quilt and we're stitching the binding down to the front. So you're going to go all the way down this side with the back flipped to the front. Close off that raw edge of the quilt. You basically want to cover that stitch from the back. You don't want to pull at it, because if you pull at it, it's going to make the back side a lot thinner than the front because you're pulling it to the front. You don't want that. You want it to be equal on the front and the back. Then you're going to get to the corner. And you're going to take the corner edge. You're going to pull that binding piece back away from it so that you've got the raw edge of the quilt. You can clip the tiny corner of that quilt portion, not the binding portion, the quilt portion. You can clip a little tiny corner of that so that it won't be so bulky in your corners. Then you're gonna sew almost to the end. Then you're gonna pull up the corner, and I'll show you again in just a second so you can see it a little bit better. You're gonna take this corner and you're gonna sew all the way to the end. Then it's gonna look like that. It's just gonna go off the edge. You're gonna take that portion that falls off the edge and turn it back over it. So you have a nice crisp corner right there. We'll do it again in just a minute. Now we get to this corner and we're gonna take this edge, we're gonna hold back the binding, and now you've got just your raw edge of your quilt right here. You're gonna clip just the small corner of the quilt itself, not the binding. You're gonna throw that away. You don't wanna get to your seam line. You wanna cut it right above where you stitch so you don't cut those stitches out. Then you're gonna put it back into the machine. And you're gonna sew the rest of that line down. Let me just cut these threads first. So you're gonna put it back about where you quit sewing, and you're gonna start sewing again. You're gonna get to that corner, and that corner piece of that binding is just gonna be falling off. And then you wanna take the other edge of it and fold it back up. So what I did was, I had it like this, where this side I sewed all the way down. This piece right here is not sewed down yet, so it's just hanging on the edge of the quilt. You're going to take it and you're going to fold that piece down. Then you're going to have that pretty seam in the corner, and you're going to start sewing from here all the way down this edge. That's all I did. Then when I got to that corner and I've locked that side in, I'm turning my quilt to start the next row. And now I'm going to stitch down this side. Now we're at the part where we began. So you're going to sew all the way up to the part where you started, overlay it a little bit, back stitch it in, and you're done with the stitching. You're going to pull this off the machine and you're going to cut your threads. And at that point, you are done with binding. And that's it. Now let's take it up here and look at it. Okay, now we are done with the sewing of the binding. We have our quilt top done. The next thing you'd want to do is lay it out and go around it. Clip any excess string, any long threads you've got hanging, and you will definitely have some. Check your corners. Make sure your corners look good. That one does. Here's a close-up of the quilt so you can see better what it looks like. The circle stitching turned out good with this pattern. Turned out cute. We didn't use a plain solid color for the binding this time. We wanted to use something fun since this was a fun fabric line. This is the K Facet fabric line, and this is another one of his prints that we used on the back. Turned out really cute. So see, you can make a quilt.